I want to share with you a story, and this story is probably the core of my own personal belief system. It predates me getting into yoga, but it was probably the first true spiritual experience that I had ever had, and it has informed my own healing, outlook on life, and most certainly the intention behind the Yoga of Awakening. So I think it's important for you that as you go through this journey with me, especially because I talk so much about spirituality and God, that you understand what it is that drives this dialogue and my relationship to it. So I left home, New Jersey, in 1984, and I moved to New York City, and I got a job as a bartender in an all-male gay sex club. And the name of this club was called Heaven, and it was in an old church. And I was the only female that was allowed into the club. It was an extraordinary time in New York City in the 80s, and this was quite an extraordinary job that I had, and I loved it. The men who came to this club were very kind to me and supportive and certainly loving, especially one man, and this man's name was Billy. And Billy came into the club most nights, and when I tell the story of Billy, I think of him right away. I can see him. He was a very tall African-American man, probably around 58 years old. He always wore red leathered pants and a white kind of cut-off t-shirt. And Billy had a strong affection for me. Now, during that time, I was partying a lot, as most perhaps young people in New York City on their own would do. And Billy had a problem with my drinking and my doing drugs, and never ever hesitated to let me know that he was concerned, which I found funny considering the environment that we were in. What I knew of Billy was that he was born and raised in Ohio. He had been married, he had had some children, and when Billy came to terms with his sexuality, he was ostracized by his church. I remember they were Baptists. He was ostracized from his church, and he was rejected by his family. And he moved away from Ohio and came to live in New York City, where he could live in his truth. And although he was a lovely and charismatic man, I also got a sense that he was incredibly lonely. And we would spend hours just talking about life, and he was so interesting and kind and funny. Well, about a 3-week period goes by where Billy doesn't show up at the club, and which was very, very odd. And I had no way of reaching out, so I just had to kind of tolerate it. I was curious. And then one day he suddenly shows up again, and he crosses the dance floor to where I am behind the bar, and I lean up to go to hug him, and I reach to put my arm around his shoulders, and as I do, I realize that he has all these open sores along his neck and shoulder. So I pulled back and I said, "Oh my God, Billy, what is that?" And he glanced at his shoulder and said, "They're symptomatic of my disease." And I said, "What disease?" And he said, "I have AIDS." Now, this was in the 80s, and during this time, there was 40 reported cases of HIV. Now there's 40 million. At that time, there was no cure. There's no cure now, but there was no treatment. And although I worked in an all-male gay sex club, I was still not very educated or sophisticated and ignorant enough that when he said the word AIDS, I recoiled. I pulled back. And I remember how sad he looked when I did that, and I remember the feeling of shame that overwhelmed me, knowing that I had just rejected him in that way. And he asked me if I wanted to understand more about his disease, and I said, of course. And so he told me how he thinks he contracted it, and I asked a lot of questions, like could I get it if he kissed me or if he sweat on me, and he answered all my questions. And my final question to him, I said, I asked him about treatment, and he told me that there was no treatment, and I said, well, then what's going to happen? And he said, I'm dying. Not I'm going to die. It was very much in the present tense. He said, I'm dying. And I asked him if he was afraid, and he said to me that he wasn't. And because he had such strong faith, and because of his belief in God, he recognized that this was a part of his journey, a part of his experience, and that he was not afraid. And for the second time that night, I must have recoiled. But this time he smiled and he said, Sean, do you believe in God? And I said, no, I don't. And at that time I didn't. I was raised in a fairly agnostic family, and my experience of God was always very patriarchal. Every single time I messed up, which was often, there was always a sense of punishment, as though I was being held to this ridiculously high standard that I, or really no one, could live up to. And so because this idea of God that was put upon me just through my socialization, I rejected the notion of God, and I decided I didn't care and was disconnected from it, disinterested. So I said, no, I don't believe in God. And Billy again laughed, and he said, Sean, do you want to see God right now? And I looked around the club, and I said, yeah, sure, show me God here. And he points to Danny the Wonder Pony. Danny the Wonder Pony was a white guy who showed up at the club most nights, butt naked except for a pair of chaps and a saddle. And for $1, you can climb on Danny's back, and he would trot around the dance floor, and you can hit him with a switch. And Billy points to this gentleman and says, God's right there. And then Billy points to this cross-dresser, and that's what you would have called this person at that time. I guess now it would be considered transgendered. But this was probably the worst cross-dresser of all New York City. This person was about 6'6" and would wear a light blue house coat, gloves, sensible shoes with pantyhose, a gray wig with a hat and a veil, and a little pocketbook. Looked very much like the outfit my very Jewish, very Polish grandmother would have worn. And Billy points to this person and said, God's right there. And then Billy points to two gentlemen sitting at a bar in a booth, and they were drinking Budweisers, and they looked like they come right from the office wearing suits, like my two very straight brothers, and they're just arguing over these beers. And Billy says, God's right there. And then Billy takes his hand, big hand, and he puts it over my chest. And he takes my hand, my little hand, and he puts it over his. And he stands there holding me like this and said, and Sean, God is right here. And he said, I'm going to say something to you now, and my hope is that you can remember this for the whole of your life, which obviously I have. And it's this next line that has influenced what I believe, my relationship with God, and really has given me the purpose in my life. Billy said to me, Sean, ignore the story and see the soul, and remember to love. You will never regret it. Ignore the story and see the soul, and remember to love. You will never regret it. Danny the Wonder Pony, the cross-dresser, those two people at the booth, me, Billy, all of this, we all have a story. We all have lessons to learn, karma to burn, circumstances to work out, and we really don't know why things happen in the way that they do, but they do so that we can unfold and learn and grow and transform. So we have to ignore the story and instead see the soul, the light, the love, the essence that exists within each being, and allow space for that being to be where they're at. It's between them and God, and remember to love. It's all we have, it's all we know, it's all that connects us to each other. And his last line, you'll never regret it. It is so true. It is the underlying factor that opens us to our own divinity, and it reminds us again and again and again of what is truly important and the interdependency of all things. Ignore the story and see the soul, and remember to love. You will never regret it. Over the years, I've traveled all over the world, and I have sat at the feet of saints and sages and religious leaders and teachers. And never in all that time have I been more informed than I was in an all-male gay sex club called Heaven in an old church. Angels show up in very unique ways. They come to remind us, to inform us, and to lead us into our path and onto our destiny. I couldn't have heard the language of love and God in any other way that would have made sense. So I offer this story so that you understand where I come from. What Billy told me is that God is that which exists within, that is of truth and love. And how we relate to that changes, evolves, grows as we evolve and mature over time. It's something that gets uncovered. It's something that's discovered. More importantly, it's something that's awakened. It's not something that we look outside of ourselves for or seek. It's a part of this awakening that allows us to be more empathetic and more humble in the process. We spend so much time judging others, thinking that their experience should be different, and instead of recognizing that that judgment is within us, therefore that judgment is the thing that's keeping us from love. And so it's the story of Billy that motivates the Yoga of Awakening, that has put me on a process to release the tension, to recognize the limited beliefs, the oppression, the judgment that we all have, and to create an environment through yoga, through breath work, through meditation, through prayer, through therapy, to continually cleanse ourselves from these perceptions so that we can see the truth beyond reason, so that we can step into the mystery, and so that we can love. So as I talk about God throughout these practices, it's not to impose my understanding of God onto you. It's to hopefully give you space to explore that God that is within. When I talk about spirituality, it's not limited to religion. You can be an atheist and have a strong spiritual practice if your belief system is motivated by truth and love. In this conscious form, there's nothing more holier. Billy died just actually a few weeks after that conversation, as did many of the men that I had met during that time. And my commitment is to continue to honor the human experience for what it is, to hopefully end oppressive belief systems that block people from living their own life in the way that they're supposed to, that's between them and their God, and to allow us a process to take responsibility so that we can truly honor ourselves, each other as one. And if we can do that in this conscious form, I can't imagine anything more divine, more holy. I'm grateful to the experience that I had and this introduction to spirit in the way that it was. And I hope that as you go through this process, you'll allow yourself to stay really open to the mystery, open to all of your teachers and the ways that they have shown up, and be willing to look at your experiences through a bigger, broader spiritual lens. I honor Billy and all the Billies that exist in this world, all of our teachers and the ways in which they inform. God bless.